Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Alex. And we have our friend Trymaine Lee joining us here at the end of the hour. That's what I've got to look forward to.
I will be looking forward to it as well.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you.
Good show.
Well, tonight, President Biden is walking into a fundraiser in San Francisco right about now, where he will continue to build his big lead over Donald Trump in campaign fundraising. Before the president left for California yesterday, this was the single most childish question the White House press corps delivered.
Mr. President, good afternoon, sir. You're going to California. Is this about coming up with a plan B for 2024? Does Gavin need to stand by?
Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm looking at you.
Yes,
We're looking at you.
Sir, Nikki Haley or Donald Trump?
Whoa. What I came to tell you was, I told you we'd be announcing sanctions on Russia. We'll have a major package announced on Friday. I'll be happy to sit with you all while doing that, okay?
Who would you rather challenge in November, Nikki Haley or Donald Trump?
Oh, I don't care.
And they don't care. They don't care that Joe Biden just described the serious work that he is doing in the Oval Office behind closed doors, developing a new package of sanctions against Russia for Vladimir Putin's assassination of Putin's political opponent, Alexei Navalny. They don't care. They are horse race reporters, and the horse race is the presidential campaign. And so you can rely on them to waste an opportunity to talk to the president of the United States about the actual work that he does, and instead come up with wise guy questions like, does Gavin need to stand by? That's a reference, of course, to California Governor Gavin Newsom, who could not be more strongly supporting Joe Biden's reelection campaign. Those reporters and much of the pundit class and recreational commentators on presidential campaigns, whose voices are heard on a variety of non-political shows and podcasts, don't understand where we are in the presidential campaign. The short answer to where we are in the presidential campaign is that we are in the fourth quarter of the presidential campaign. The truth is that presidential campaigns are 4 years long. The news media doesn't begin covering them until the third year of the campaign. We're now in the fourth year of the campaign. When Donald Trump was inaugurated as the president of the United States on January 20th, 2017, the other thing he did that very day was file his candidacy papers for re-election. So if you think of a presidential campaign as a long plane flight over, say, the Atlantic Ocean, the plane is now somewhere over the North Atlantic approaching Ireland. It's not the time for someone to decide that the pilot who has flown this plane before successfully should be pulled out of the cockpit because he's too old, and some passenger named Gavin, who has never flown one of these planes, should take over. Gavin Newsom has never been a presidential candidate in a presidential campaign. He has no idea what it's like, but he understands enough about presidential campaigns and how they work to know that it is way too late for the Democrats to change candidates. Bob Costas, the brilliant sports analyst, said recently that Joe Biden should drop out of the race. And he added that he has been saying that for 4 years. 4 years ago was the time to say it. 3 years ago was the time to say it. But it has been too late for a long time. And if Joe Biden announced 2 or 3 years ago that he wasn't going to run for re-election, he would have been the most pathetic lame duck president you've ever seen, who would not have accomplished anything, nothing, as president, because Congress could have and would have completely ignored him. Everyone who says Joe Biden should drop out, and for the purposes of this discussion, I am only referring to the people who want the Democrats to win. Every one of those people who say Joe Biden should drop out must now say exactly who the nominee should be. And none of them do. None of them say that. Some of them suggest a long string of names of possibilities. That list always includes Gavin Newsom. And so you would think that in their articles and their comments on podcasts and TV, they would show you all of those polls where Gavin Newsom polls better than Joe Biden against Donald Trump. There must be so many of those polls, but there aren't any. The most recent poll substituting other Democratic names for Biden against Donald Trump, included only Vice President Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom. It's an Emerson poll that is now 10 days old. Donald Trump was polling at 45 against Joe Biden at 44. Substituting Kamala Harris as the candidate produced a result of Donald Trump polling at 46 against Vice President Harris at 43. And substituting Gavin Newsom's name produced an even worse result, with Trump polling at 46 and Gavin Newsom polling at 36. 36. Gavin Newsom might not know how to run a presidential campaign, but he knows how to read polls. You would think, with the way the media obsessed over every poll it can find, that they would have noticed these polls. And how does today's poll from Quinnipiac fit in the dump Biden strategy? A national poll by Quinnipiac shows Joe Biden at 49 and Donald Trump at 45. Now, I mentioned the polls not because I have great faith in polls at this stage of the campaign, but just to point out the challenge you have if you want to argue that the Democratic nominee for president should not be Joe Biden. There is no substitute candidate who polls better than Joe Biden. Now, assuming you still believe in Gavin Newsom, even though he's polling 10 points behind Donald Trump, you must then explain how your choice of nominee gets the nomination. The more thoughtful dump Biden proponents have actually recently tried to work their way through the maze of how someone other than Joe Biden can be nominated for the president in the Democratic Party. They all rely on Joe Biden, first of all, releasing all of his delegates at the convention on Monday, August 19th. And they all assume that the delegates who have showed up for the convention, at least 90% of whom will be Biden delegates, maybe more, will then easily agree on Gavin Newsom. You certainly get the feeling that most people who want to dump Joe Biden also want to dump Kamala Harris from the ticket. They don't seem to fear what would happen among a key voting demographic who delivered the presidency to Joe Biden and the vice presidency to Kamala Harris: Black women voters. One thoughtful essay about this process reminded us that this is the way Abraham Lincoln was chosen at the Republican convention in 1860. It took 3 long ballots to nominate Abraham Lincoln. You can expect the balloting at the Democratic convention in August to take at least 3 ballots, maybe more. And you can imagine what the press would say about the Democrats struggling to nominate a candidate and how much disarray they would figure into their reporting. You can hope that it's not a rerun of the 1924 Democratic Convention in New York City, when it took 103 ballots to nominate John Davis, who went on to lose to Calvin Coolidge. That Democratic Convention lasted from June 24th to July 9th. 2 weeks to get a nominee who would lose. The last time the Democrats nominated a presidential candidate that way, he lost to Republican Richard Nixon. This is what that convention looked like in 1968 in Chicago, where there was violence in that convention hall and days of violence outside the convention hall, which was later described as a riot by the Chicago police against peaceful protesters by a commission that investigated the riots at the 1968 Democratic Convention, which ended up nominating Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who then went on to lose, because that's what happens after violent conventions like that. The Democratic Convention in Chicago is in Chicago again this year. And as it happens, the magic number of delegates for winning the presidential nomination is 1968. 1,968. There are going to be protesters. There always are. Usually they are not violent. This year there will definitely be protesters supporting Israel, and there will definitely be protesters supporting Palestinians. The television cameras will be trained on those protesters more than on delegates. The longer the convention goes on, trying to find a nominee, the messier it could get in Chicago. The modern, orderly convention that is really are television shows produced by the party last 4 days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And Thursday night, in primetime, is always the triumphant speech by the nominee. But at a contested convention, we have no idea what Thursday night might bring. Politically, throwing the nomination open in a contested convention is a step into the unknown. One thoughtful essay that has worked through this scenario suggests it would be very exciting TV for the first time at a political convention. That means for the first time since 1968, when you could watch the rioting live on TV during the convention, sometimes in split screens that showed the protesters being beaten in the streets by the Chicago police while the Chicago political machine's henchmen were beating up reporters in the convention hall. Exciting is one word you could use for that kind of TV. It was also horrifying. The Republican nominee for president, Richard Nixon, was watching the Democratic convention on TV, and that is when he knew he was going to win in November. I mentioned that Joe Biden's at a fundraiser tonight where he is crushing Donald Trump in the fundraising competition. The latest campaign finance reports show that the Biden-Harris reelection campaign has $56 million on hand at the end of January, while the Trump campaign had only $30 million on hand. President Biden's also raising money with and for the Democratic National Committee, which has $24 million on hand at the end of January. The Republican National Committee has $8 million at the end of January. In the month of January alone, the Trump campaign raised $8.8 million and spent $11.4 million. Donald Trump has spent a total of $50 million on lawyers during the campaign and will spend much more. Other PACs and fundraising committees supporting the Biden-Harris ticket had a combined $117 million at the beginning of this year. And here's the part right here. Here's the part of the story that no one who has said Joe Biden should drop out or has written that Joe Biden should drop out has ever mentioned. That every other Democrat whose name shows up in these articles as a substitute for Joe Biden, as the Democratic nominee, has raised exactly zero money for a presidential campaign. No one has told you about the money. That means none of them have thought for a second about the money. Every serious observer of presidential campaigns is supposed to know how important campaign money is, and not one of these people who are telling you it's time to get rid of Joe Biden seem to have given a thought to the money. So here's what they haven't told you or simply do not know. Not one penny Gavin Newsom has in his campaign treasury in California is usable in a presidential campaign. Money raised for statewide elections of governors in California and other states is raised under different laws than the laws governing federal campaign money. So Gavin Newsom has zero to spend on a presidential campaign as of tonight. And Gavin Newsom knows that. And Gavin Newsom, if he can get the nomination, would then leave the convention with no ability to even fly his way home. So let me say that number again, zero. That's how many dollars Gavin Newsom would have to spend, would have to spend on a presidential campaign, leaving the Democratic convention. He'd have zero. There is one other candidate besides Joe Biden who has raised money for a presidential campaign, and that only that one candidate who's done that is Kamala Harris. The money raised for the Biden-Harris campaign has been raised in the name of both candidates. So Kamala Harris has a legal claim on all of that money if Joe Biden were to drop out of the race. All the imagined contested Democratic convention candidates there would only be one candidate, Kamala Harris, who would actually have real money for a presidential campaign. And that might be decisive. That might get her the nomination in this scenario at the convention after who knows how many ballots. But at least Kamala Harris could leave the convention with real money to spend on a presidential campaign, and no one else could. So when someone tells you Biden should drop out. Immediately ask them who the candidate should be. Then ask how that candidate can get the nomination, on how many ballots, and then ask the question that you know has never passed through their minds: what about the money? And if they can't answer all of those questions to your satisfaction, you are not talking to someone with a solution. We don't have time to explain the complexities of nominating a vice presidential candidate at a contested convention. Let's just assume that all of the delegates would agree that whoever wins the presidential nomination gets to choose their own vice president. If Kamala Harris is not on that ticket, the candidates who are on that ticket would have to very politely ask her to agree to move all of the Biden-Harris campaign money to the Democratic National Committee, which is the only legal move that can be made with that money. Kamala Harris would still want to beat Donald Trump, and so I'm sure she and Joe Biden would agree to move their campaign money to the Democratic National Committee, but she would not be able to move all of her voters. Most of her most ardent supporters would, I'm sure, in the end, on Election Day, find their way to voting against Donald Trump. But that's not what happened in 1968. In 1968, enough voters who supported the anti-Vietnam War candidate, Senator Gene McCarthy, at the 1968 convention, left that convention so embittered by what they saw as Hubert Humphrey stealing the nomination. Hubert Humphrey did not run in a single primary, and Gene McCarthy heroically did run and did win primaries. Enough primaries that McCarthy voters angrily then stayed home in November. And Richard Nixon won the presidency by 1% of the vote. That is why, ever since 1968, the Democratic Party has always been trying to design the smoothest, most predictable, least dramatic conventions that they possibly can. And that's why both parties turned the conventions into what have usually been dull television shows. Because the last time a convention wasn't smooth and predictable, there was blood in the streets and blood in the convention hall and bitterness on Election Day, enough bitterness to lose the election for the Democrats. All of the people who suggest that Biden should step aside because they want the Democrats to win are basing that strategy on the notion that Joe Biden is just too old. And the notion that Joe Biden is too old is based on a complete and utter misunderstanding of the work of the presidency. The job is to make decisions, not speeches. History writes about the decisions. That's what matters. If you have worked in government, you know that, because speech making is the only thing that the news media is allowed to watch. In a presidency, the news media insists that that must be important. It's just like the Super Bowl. You can remember what Patrick Mahomes did on the field, but you can't remember a word of his speech. And that's for a very good reason. The job is on the field. Everyone who sees Joe Biden doing his job behind closed doors believes he is fully capable to do that job and is good at that job, including former Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who, though he disagreed with Joe Biden, always thought President Biden was fully capable when he was in the room negotiating with him last year. Last year, when Joe Biden managed to do what seemed impossible and convince the Republican Speaker of the House to go along with a deal that would prevent the United States of America from defaulting on its debt for the first time in history and violating the debt ceiling. It looked impossible at the outset, but Joe Biden did it. Jon Stewart asked a question recently that makes sense in the age of the ubiquitous camera. We all have one in our pocket. He asked, did anyone film that? And he was referring to all of those reports that are out there from people who have been in private meetings and negotiations with President Biden and have seen him perform flawlessly. Did anyone film that? That's the problem with the presidency. We only film the parts that don't matter. We are not allowed to film the real job. We are not allowed to film the real governing discussions in the Oval Office that might or might not include classified information, but will definitely include statements about senators and congressmen possible strategies, details of policy dilemmas that no one in that room wants to be made public at that time. Every meeting I was in the Oval Office when I worked in the Senate involved legislative strategies that we did not want made public and would have failed if they were made public. I was never once in a meeting in the Oval Office or the Cabinet Room or in the Senate Majority Leader's office or the Speaker's office or anywhere where real governing occurred with the door closed where cameras could possibly be allowed. Not for 1 minute. The thing to know about cameras in government is if the camera is rolling, nothing really important is happening. What you're watching is the theater. The governing will not be televised. And by the governing, I mean the very moments when the president makes a decision. I was in the Oval Office where I saw President Bill Clinton make a presidential decision on extremely high-stakes, high-pressure tax legislation that ultimately passed by one vote. And that decision involved the president having to change his very public position on a very important piece of the legislation. And I was more impressed with the speed and authority and confidence with which Bill Clinton made that decision in seconds in the Oval Office than I ever was by any Bill Clinton speech. I cannot remember a single line from any Clinton State of the Union address, but I can remember every word he said in the Oval Office that day, where the actual work of the presidency was done. Politico's latest entry in the genre, under the headline, "Democrats Might Need a Plan B," at least admits this at the outset. Because of procedural and political hurdles, it would not be easy to simply swap him out. The likeliest outcome is that Biden stays on the ticket. And after correctly describing the likeliest outcome, the Politico piece goes on into pages of fantasy about what could happen at a contested convention. Ezra Klein has written the very smartest entry in the genre in the New York Times. Ezra Klein is smarter than I am on just about everything, and I've learned a lot from Ezra. Ezra Klein lists all of President Biden's more than impressive accomplishments with a Senate divided almost 50-50. But Ezra does not think that Joe Biden should step aside, and let the Democrats figure it out at the convention. Ezra Klein writes, "I am convinced he is able to do the job of the presidency. He is sharp in meetings. He makes sound judgments. I cannot point you to a moment where Biden faltered in his presidency because his age had slowed him. I like Biden. I think he's been a good president. I think he is a good president." And then Ezra Klein says, the age of 81 doesn't mean anything. It's the impression Biden is giving of age, of slowness, of frailty. The presidency is a performance. That is what television did to the presidency, made it a performance. The political press only knows how to cover the performance like theater critics. They have no idea how to cover the job. And they make no real attempt to cover the job. Most of them will always make the lazier choice to cover the performance and never attempt to actually inform voters about what really matters in the presidency. The names you always see at the top of the lists of greatest presidents, including Roosevelt, Lincoln, Washington, would all have failed in the television age on what is expected in the version of performance of the presidency. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was 19 years younger than Joe Biden when he was running in his last re-election campaign. He was slowly dying during his last campaign, and his doctors knew it. And in fact, he died just over 2 months after his inauguration in 1945. But during that last year of his life, when he would fall asleep at his desk, sometimes in the middle of signing his name, he was also personally strategizing with, consulting with Winston Churchill, General George Marshall, General Dwight Eisenhower, about the single largest military operation in history, the D-Day invasion in France, in the middle of his re-election campaign. President Roosevelt had overruled the generals at various stages of World War II prior to that. And as history shows, he chose a better course than they recommended when he was overruling them. They urged a D-Day invasion 2 years before the American military was actually capable and ready to do it. And old Franklin Roosevelt, nodding off sometimes, overruled those younger minds, those military experts, those generals, and he saved American soldiers' lives in the process. Franklin Roosevelt was secretly managing the development of an atomic bomb in what they thought was a race with Nazi Germany to develop an atomic bomb. It was FDR who built the flawless structure of secrecy around the work Robert Oppenheimer was leading at Los Alamos to develop the most powerful weapon in history. Franklin Roosevelt was designing the United Nations for the post-war period, calling it the United Nations, deciding which countries would be members of the Security Council, which countries should have veto power. He was calculating every day how to deal with the Soviet Union's dictator Joseph Stalin as an ally then in combat against Nazi Germany, and how he would have to deal with Stalin as a potential adversary after World War II. Nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union, the creation of social security system, which Franklin Roosevelt had done 10 years earlier, were all issues far more complex than every issue that passed through George Washington's mind or Abraham Lincoln's mind in the presidency. Franklin Roosevelt was making decisions about those issues, sometimes in bed, sometimes when he was nodding off, always in his wheelchair when he was out of bed, sometimes after long naps, sometimes when just speaking itself took every bit of strength he had. And whenever President Roosevelt had to be awakened in the middle of the night with the latest battle news in World War II, even as his physical energy was seeping out of him, he was always ready. He was always ready to do his job in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day. He was always ready to make the next decision. And no, we don't have any film of that. Donald Trump, the self-proclaimed billionaire, wants to use, of course, other people's money to pay the more than $500 million he owes following last week's civil fraud judgment. The Guardian is reporting the immediate priority for Trump's legal agenda remains, according to people familiar with the matter, figuring out how to come up with $450 million, a figure that includes prejudgment interest, or finding a company prepared to help him post bond within 30 days of when the court entered the judgment so that he can appeal the penalty. His lawyers have contacted several companies to provide the bond. Surprising the first one didn't agree to it. And Georgia Governor Brian Kemp said this about the interview that he agreed to do with Special Prosecutor Jack Smith.
I basically told them the same thing I told the special grand juries, that I followed the law and the Constitution and answered all their questions truthfully.
Trump is making an argument right now that is in the hands of the Supreme Court, where it goes that he has broad immunity from being president and that he can't be prosecuted for anything he did while he was in office. I wonder what you make of that claim.
Well, listen, I don't think anybody's above the law, you know, a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, myself, or anybody else. So that's my personal opinion.
Do you think that those cases should go to trial before the election so voters can make a decision based off that?
Well, listen, I think most voters probably feel the same way I do. I mean, we're a country that was built on laws and the Constitution, and it's you know, up to us really as elected leaders to be the ones that exemplify that in a lot of ways. So we'll see where the process plays out. I think probably they will be ruled on for the election.
Joining us now is Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney and professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. She is co-host of the podcast Sisters in Law and MSNBC legal analyst. Joyce, so we just heard from the governor that he talked to Jack Smith, told him everything that he told the grand jury in Georgia. He sounds very much like a cooperating witness to the extent that he can be helpful.
Well, I think that's right. Cooperating witness is maybe not the correct term here, in the sense that we often think of cooperators as people who could have been defendants or who have lots of evidence to give. But one thing that's clear is that Kemp has made a decision that his obligation is to the law. And Lawrence, I think the interesting unknown here is whether or not Kemp had communications directly with Trump or with anyone else on his staff We know that they were making calls encouraging people in a lot of different states not to certify the votes. So perhaps he has something more interesting to discuss than the public is aware of right now.
Yeah, and it's the other thing that's so striking about it, and shouldn't be, is that he's saying what any sane person should say about this, but it is just so striking that a high-level Republican elected official is willing to say, yeah, Donald Trump's not above the law.
You know, the political reality in Georgia is that in many ways it's a deeply conservative state. It has sent Marjorie Taylor Greene to the House of Representatives. But Metro Atlanta is a modern business area. They've got the Atlanta airport. Delta is headquartered in Atlanta. And we've seen in the past where Georgia has adopted policies that were perceived as not forward-leaning. The business community has suffered. So the governor does have the ability on issues like this that, as you say, and I think the point you make is so important, it should be so unremarkable to hear a governor say that no one is above the law, not him, not a Democrat, not a Republican. And yet in this day and age, it is very remarkable to hear that from a Republican governor.
So we have reporting that Donald Trump's lawyers have been talking to several possible companies for somehow float a bond for him. Not surprising that they would have to talk to several. It's hard to imagine any real company lender wanting to be involved with that.
There's still a little bit of a mystery around the first E. Jean Carroll trial where the verdict was only $5 million and Trump paid all of that money into the court fund instead of posting a bond. We don't know if that was because he couldn't get one or if he just had a preference. But clearly here, the better option is to get a bond. And that means Trump will have to make sure that the bond company is comfortable, that he will pay his court judgment if it's affirmed on appeal. That means he'll have to find collateral that's not used on another loan to attach to this or cash assets. And apparently it's something of a struggle for him.
I would expect so. Joyce Vance, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lawrence.
And coming up, Republicans in Congress just lost their star witness against the Bidens. And so now the Republican plan is to just keep lying about it. That's next. Did you have a nice Valentine's Day? Alexander Smirnov did not. On Valentine's Day, he admitted to the FBI that he had been lying to them. And so last week, 43-year-old Alexander Smirnov was indicted for making false statements to the FBI about President Biden and his son, Hunter Biden. A filing in the case by prosecutors says he is actively peddling new lies that could impact U.S. elections after meeting with Russian intelligence officials in November. Alexander Smirnov was, until he got indicted for lying to the FBI about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, the single most important witness that House Republicans claimed could make their case to impeach Joe Biden. Now that their most important witness has been indicted for lying to the FBI about Joe Biden, the Republican plan seems to be just keep lying.
What do you think of the Smirnov indictment?
Well, I mean, it is what it is, so doesn't change the fundamental facts.
Joining us now is Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI Assistant Director of Counterintelligence. He's an MSNBC national security analyst, and Glenn Kirshner, a former federal prosecutor and host of the Justice Matters podcast. He is an MSNBC legal analyst. And Frank, doesn't seem to change the fundamental facts. I don't know about that.
I know about it. This has all been a fabrication, and we can tell those who disbelieve that the FBI has confirmed that this guy's a liar, and so much so that the Department of Justice, a U.S. Attorney's Office, and a federal magistrate has determined this needs to go forward with criminal charges for lying to the FBI. What we're left with is a lot of unanswered questions, Lawrence, which is, for example, what happened at the FBI and when. There have been some reports that as much as over 3 years ago, the FBI started to doubt what Smirnov was telling them. Was the source properly handled? Was he polygraphed? Did they understand that he could be doubled back on them? When did the Russians know that they had a guy in touch daily, reportedly, with FBI agents, and that they could feed him disinformation that would somehow get to Congress? Lots of questions here, but we also have learned why even more the FBI director, Chris Wray, was so reluctant to turn over an unredacted 1023, a source report, to Congress, because at that point, they knew something smelled badly and an unredacted, unconfirmed source report was going to be exploited.
Glenn Kirshner, here's the FBI working with this guy over a period of time, and it just feels to us out here that there had to be days when people were walking out of the room going, what do you think of this guy? Can we trust this guy?
Yeah, as Frank knows, anytime you're dealing with confidential informants or sources or even the more formal cooperating witnesses, once somebody's pleaded guilty and agreed to testify about the crimes of others, the three most important words are corroboration, corroboration, and corroboration. And it feels like somebody dropped the ball here, because this information that now it turns out is basically Russian disinformation just had this direct pipeline to the FBI first and foremost, and then ultimately directly to Congress. And I think the big question now is, what will the Republican members of Congress do now that they know that these are lies that they have been peddling as ably assisted by Fox News? Will they continue to peddle those lies? And if they do, Lawrence, I heard Congressman Daniel Goldman on this network earlier this evening saying something that I am in agreement with. He said, if the members of Congress now continue to peddle knowing lies that are a product of Russian propaganda and disinformation, they should be criminally investigated for being part and parcel of a conspiracy to defraud the United States and to interfere in our elections. And Representative Goldman himself, a former federal prosecutor, knows whereof he speaks.
So, Frank, will we learn all the ins and outs of this if this case goes to trial?
Likely not everything. In fact, quite frankly, even the detention hearing in Nevada was likely devoid of the classified elements of this, which may have contributed to that magistrate in Las Vegas going, hey, I don't think we can hold him. I don't know what you've got here. And they're trying again. Reportedly, now the prosecutors are going to try again to get him detained, and likely going to share far more sensitive information about his contacts with Russian intel. For example, he's been in contact with people associated with Russian assassins. He's given up way too much information about Russian intel. And it's possible he could be the subject of an assassination himself. He's got an Israeli passport. He can go get another one, even though they took it from him from the Israeli consulate, and he could leave. So there's a lot here we're not going to learn because it's classified, but we are going to learn more as this case goes forward.
Glenn, how do the prosecutors balance what they can reveal against what they actually have to use to make their case?
Yeah, that's always a tough balance to strike, because you don't want to let somebody like this walk out of the front doors of the courtroom, because you haven't disclosed enough to satisfy a magistrate or a judge that he is a flight risk. I read this 28-page detention memo, and it sure feels like he is a flight risk. So you also don't want to compromise ongoing investigations. You don't want to compromise sources and methods. So it is a really tough balance to strike. But I'll tell you, I'm hoping that the prosecutors strike the balance in favor of doing everything they can to convince the judge to whom they are now appealing this detention decision to keep this man detained pending trial. Because, I think if he is released, the assets he has, he lied to the pretrial service agency saying, I only have about $6,500. And it was discovered he had access to more than $6 million. He's got the means to flee. He's got no connections to the U.S. So I suspect we will not be seeing him again if he's allowed to leave.
Let's listen to what Congressman Jamie Raskin said about this.
The foundation of the whole impeachment investigation were the allegations that were advanced by Smirnov and then reported in that FBI Form 1023. And yesterday it all exploded. Not only do we know they're false and fraudulent, but we know that they were likely concocted along with Russian intelligence operatives. So to me, the whole thing smells like Vladimir Putin is all over it.
So, Frank, this leaves their impeachment process stranded. It would seem, I'm not sure, but, you know, there was never really any basis to go forward anyway.
Yeah, we can never count on anything these days. But clearly, we now know this. This was a Russian operation, at least in the last couple of years with Smirnov. And now, if the GOP continues to assert this information, they are part of that operation. They are regurgitating Russian intelligence disinformation. That's where we are.
Frank Figliuzzi and Glenn Kirshner, thank you both very much for joining our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you. And coming up, Pulitzer Prize-winning MSNBC correspondent Trymaine Lee has launched a new 5-part series of his podcast, Into America. There's an important story that developed today in Los Angeles that Trymaine has been, the kind of story he has been covering. He's going to join us on that next. In 1957, Silas White had a dream, and he had the money to make it happen. He bought a building on Ocean Avenue in Santa Monica with a fabulous view of the ocean and an easy pathway down to the beach, where he intended to create a beach club for African Americans, a place where Black people in Los Angeles would know they could go and they could use when they went to the beach. A year later, the city of Santa Monica took over that property by eminent domain, claiming they had an important use for it. The city just turned it into a parking lot where there really wasn't much need for a parking lot. The city of Santa Monica still owns that land and collects rent from the very prominent and very hip Viceroy Hotel, which now stands on that property. This is the latest example of Black people being robbed of the kind of generational wealth that could be built on beachfront property in the Los Angeles area. Silas White's descendants are now asking the Santa Monica City Council for fair compensation for what was taken from them. Our next guest, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Trymaine Lee, has been investigating stories like this in his podcast, his MSNBC just premiered podcast, the latest installment of Into America. Joining us now is MSNBC correspondent Trymaine Lee, host of the podcast Into America. Trymaine, I thought of you when I saw this story today. There's been some previous reporting on it, but it came to my attention today, local TV coverage of it in Santa Monica. And it's so horribly repetitive of a story on Manhattan Beach, which is just south, a couple of beaches south of Santa Monica Beach in California, that took years to deal with. And here we are again.
Lawrence, it's amazing to think about the stories that we're hearing every single day. And it only brings to mind the stories that we don't know, the thousands or countless stories, I should say, from all across the country where the federal government, the state and local government either outright stole, wealth from Black folks, created barriers around them, or fleeced them of value. And as you mentioned, the idea that, this real estate and property, real wealth in America, as we know, real estate isn't, the driver of wealth in America. It is American wealth. And we've been exploring these stories, and each and every single one of them are heartbreaking, because it begs the big question, what could have been if Black folks would have been made whole throughout history.
And so, Trymaine, in this story, the Silas White story, one of the things that happens is the family stops talking about it. After a generation or two, they just stop talking about it. And one of his descendants was on local LA TV News saying, I just discovered, I didn't know about it. This young woman appeared to be in her 30s or so. And so that must have happened so many times around the country, where it kind of disappeared even from the family's own knowledge.
Well, there's often the deep pain and anguish of that loss, but then we think about some of the prior generations who've experienced great trauma. There is a silencing, a chilling effect on that. But also sometimes in America, the records just get lost. There are old records rooms who, don't take care of the records. There are fires. There are people who have intentionally buried some of these facts and details. But in our, podcast, Uncounted Millions, The Power of Reparations, we actually go back to a time when America was considering how to repay, the descendants of enslaved people or the formerly enslaved. And we actually found a time, Lawrence, in 1862, when the federal government, for what we believe is the very first time, paid federal reparations for slavery. And they did so, though, for white enslavers. In 1862, there was an act called the Compensated Emancipation Act, which said, you know what, we are going to free the enslaved people. This was a year before the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're going to free enslaved people. And in doing so, we're also going to pay enslavers for their losses. And in our story, there was actually a black man who popped up on that list, one of 5 black families who actually purchased his family's freedom and ended up on that list and found a loophole and actually got compensated for slavery. This is the first and last time that we believe that black people were actually paid reparations. But that was just the beginning. As we learn about stories like this, generation after generation of black people who were restricted by red lines or Jim Crow, right, or eminent domain, all of these violent tactics that the federal government has used and the state and local governments have used to strip black folks of wealth.
Trymaine Lee, thank you for doing the work to deliver these stories to us, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trymaine Lee gets tonight's last word.